Gaelic for thank you. But can I thank all of you for coming? I have to say, I looked at the programme and I thought, oh my goodness, two other really interesting keynotes. And then I saw the weather and I thought, sunshine in Glasgow. Will anybody come? So I'm delighted to see each one of you here. And it is indeed a real privilege and honour for me to have been invited by ECER, and I would like to thank ECER for that invite to present this keynote address. And it's particularly just great because I'm in my own institution. I work here at the University of Glasgow. I have graduated twice from the University of Glasgow from this very hall. We do graduations here. We do graduations well at Glasgow. And it's to actually be doing the keynote in this room, for me, is icing on, in fact, it's the cherry on top of the icing on the cake. If you follow me on Twitter, you will know that I refer to this building as my beloved Gilbert Scott building. And I hope sitting in this beautiful auditorium today, you can see why I am so fond of this university and this campus. But as I was asked to do the talk, and you go, oh, me? Oh, wow, oh, well, thank you, yes. And then you think, what am I actually going to say? What am I going to talk about? And I reflected on my time in Scottish education. You can probably tell from my voice that I am Scottish, and I'm trying really hard to speak quite slowly, because you've probably also noticed that Scots speak at a great pace. But I thought, you know, I've been in and around Scottish education for 57 and a half years. Because I was 4.5 when I went to school. To save you doing the maths, yes, I'm 62. And I thought, that's a long time in education. And I've been in different parts of it. I spent 13 years in school. I spent my first 7 years in primary school, 6 years in secondary school, and then I went to what at the time was called Jordan Hill College of Education. It's now the University of Strathclyde. And I got what you needed at the time to be a primary teacher. I got a diploma in primary education. It wasn't a degree, it was a diploma. And that's maybe something to reflect on as we do this past, present, future, how teacher education has changed in that regards, in many other ways too. And so for the last, I think it's about 26, 27 years, I've had the great privilege of working here in the University of Glasgow in teacher education, doing some research, doing a lot of work in teaching, learning and scholarship, and working in this field that is, for some of you perhaps, you're thinking, you've got her to speak about inclusion and she's going to talk about gifted and talented. I'm not just going to talk about gifted and talented, by the way, but they are going to feature in my presentation. Because if we are serious about inclusion, then, and it does really mean all, then we do have to think about them. But traditionally, we've perhaps not always thought about young people who, in Scotland, we would call highly able. All these words, I think, gifted and talented, highly able, high potential, all these words, I think, are problematic. I'm going to use the term that we use in Scotland at the moment, which is highly able. So, I think I have something to say about Scottish education that I hope will be interesting. I'm not only going to talk about Scotland, of course, but I would like to explain the title. Because part of the title was part of my reflection. And as I was thinking about speaking, and I was thinking, what am I going to say? And I thought, what am I going to say about inclusion? I was taken back to my childhood. I was born in Helensburgh on the banks of the River Clyde, the birthplace of John Logie Baird, the inventor of television, Charles Rennie Mackintosh and Hill House. It's a 1-hour train ride from Glasgow. You get a quiet minute in the conference. Go and visit my hometown. It's very pretty. But I remember walking to the front of the playground before the bell went in the morning with my friends. And a bus used to come along the road. And there were young people on that bus. And we used to look at them, and some of them looked at us. We used to wave, and some of them waved at us. Some of them looked like we did. Some of them were quite jerky in their movements. Others just stared blankly out of the window. And others didn't look like us at all. And I remember asking, where are they going? And I was told, a special school. What are they going to do? I didn't really get an answer to that question. But it always stuck in my mind that these children, some of whom looked like me, seemed to go somewhere else to do, well, who knew what. And now with the work that I've done in inclusion, I kind of guess that probably their teachers actually didn't have much idea what they were going off. My teachers didn't always know what they were going off to do in this special school, presumably maybe something special. So as I reflected on that, I thought, I think I need to talk about some of these issues. And so this morning I want to take us on a bit of a journey. And I have said I became a teacher, and in my teaching, I very much had this at the back of my mind. The so what question. When I've been working in research, when I'm reading an article, when I'm talking with teachers, I'm always thinking, well, so what? So what does this mean in practice in my classroom? So what does this mean for senior management in a school? And more I've been thinking, and what does it mean for me as a teacher in higher education? What does it mean for us in higher education if you're here as a researcher and or as a lecturer as well? Because I think there's much that we can take from what we are talking about and doing with schools, and we can look and see how we need to think about these things within our higher education institutions when we're coming to think about learning and teaching for all. And so with this in mind, I'd like you to hop on the bus with me. Another wee tourist tip, very good hop on, hop off, but I'm seeing nods, some of you have already been. Very good hop on, hop off bus to see round our city. But come with me on a journey, because I want to start by taking us back to the future. Because we don't have to go terribly far back, 100 and whatever years, to be quite shocked sometimes by the language that was around. Now this is legislation for my country, but this was common language that was around at the time in much of the world. Words that we really wouldn't sort of use nowadays. And we wouldn't really, have you been at meetings recently where we've talked about the educable class of imbecile? We've maybe not used those words, but I do sometimes wonder if we are actually still sitting with some thinking lurking somewhere, where we're thinking that, but not saying that. 1913, the Mental Deficiency Scotland Act required school boards to ascertain and find the children who were defective. Now, I've looked, and it's clearly this front row here, just down here. So that's fine. We can get them, and we know where to put them and what to do with them. But it's interesting, because that's kind of the roots of that system where we used to sift and sort and segregate learners. Hugely impactful. At the same time, in the States, there was a lot of work being done, of course, around intelligence testing. Lewis Terman, Stanford Binet, all these names that you will very much know, where if we look and read Terman's book, it's very clear from the outset, I think, what he saw the potential of the IQ test to do. Some quite shocking words and ideas in that statement that's on the screen behind me. In the near future, intelligence tests will bring tens of thousands of these high-grade defectives. That word defective again coming in. Under the surveillance and protection of society, because clearly they need protection as we did from them. And it will ultimately result in curtailing the reproduction of feeble-mindedness and in the elimination of an enormous amount of crime, because clearly that's who does the crime, pauperism and industrial inefficiency. You can see the roots, and yet in the field that I have done a lot of work in, and I know some of you here too have, gifted education, even today we still see IQ being held up as a good way. I'm not so sure. especially when this was how this all started. It's little wonder that when some people do studies of 13-year-olds that are now in their 50s and they say, oh, but we don't have a black cohort. Well, we know what Terman thought about specific ethnic groups. Maybe a little wonder that you don't have a black cohort to speak to. So terminology has crept in from the past into our everyday language. And for those of you who are maybe not native English speakers, if you have been called an idiot, an imbecile, or a moron, it's not polite. It's interesting how we've taken the words of these categories and it's become in part of our everyday language. I will say about myself sometimes, oh gosh, Margaret, you're such an idiot, you did blah, blah, blah. So this is the kind of history, the past bit, if you like. And in Scotland, during World War I, they set up the Scottish Education Reform Committee. And it was actually quite forward-thinking. It was really hoping to be able to get a new curriculum. It was hoping to be a revised curriculum, progressive pedagogy introduced, and full secondary education for all, because we didn't have that. Primary, yes, but not full secondary education for all. And I'm reminded of what the process we're going through just now in Scotland, not only in Scotland, in many countries, going through that process, thinking about, actually, how do we revise the primary curriculum? How do we involve progressive pedagogy? And hopefully we do have full secondary education for all in terms of them being physically in the building. But I'm not always convinced they're there cognitively and mentally. They're sitting there, but how much deeper does it go? But this Education Reform Committee were reporting to the Scottish Education Department. There was a little bit of a different story. There, they said they were thinking about secondary education. They wanted to do something with this idea of opening up secondary education. But the conception of educability lay at the heart of the discussions they were having. And it's very clear from historical documents that the Scottish Education Department believed there was two groups. Now, we've got our front row here that are the defectives and the delinquents and so on. The rest of you on this side, well, I'm really sorry, but you're the ones that are going to leave when you're 15. This side, on the other hand, we think you're all going to make it. You're all going to go on and you're going to stay. So that was the thinking that these progressive ideas met in Scotland. There was a problem. There was a problem in the thinking of the Scottish Education Department because they believed that a relatively small percentage were endowed by nature with the mental equipment, I like that word, equipment required for secondary or university education. We've just had a very interesting PhD, Catherine sitting here at the front, submitted, that's been looking at widening participation. Yeah, she's submitted. Come on, bit of encouragement, yay. That she, just I saw lots of quiet hand claps, but she's looked at this idea of widening participation here in our own institution with young people from areas of deprivation. Some of these debates and discussions that we're having now have happened before, but I like to think we're a little bit different now and that the discussions are a little bit more nuanced and different because of what we've learned in these intervening periods. But I still think some of this thinking is underlying some of the discussions that we're having. And I know we're not alone in the world in having these discussions about inclusion, about assessment, about exams, and about how to organise learners for learning. Walter Humes was a colleague who was here at Glasgow, and he talks about the Scottish Education Department. Scotland's kind of funny. On the one hand, we want to embrace everybody. It doesn't matter where you come from. Stick in, work hard. You can do it. But on the other hand, at the same time as wanting to open up secondary education, we had this thinking. Remember, Terman's all hanging around here at this point too. We had this thinking saying, but it's not for the likes of you. It's not something that you do. And we still, and I'm sure many of you in your institutions, have young people coming for whom they are the first person in their family to come into higher education. I well remember walking in the cloisters. We had some 4-year-olds in doing some work in the museum where we had the reception last night, and there was the mum and the little girl and me, and we were holding hands walking across, and the mum looked at her and she said, "So do you think you're going to come here?" And with that disdain that only a 4-year-old can do, she said, "I might." And our mum looked across and into my eyes with tears in her eyes and said, "If she does, she'll be the first person in our family to come here." Hugely powerful. So this is where we were in the 1920s. This was happening. 1951, Scottish Education Department. You can see our categories that we now had, very common categories across many countries. Although interestingly, when I was doing some work in Tanzania, Tanzania did not have categories until we went and helped them develop categories. Well, not helpfully helped them, but you know what I mean. But we've got back to this word ineducable, this group that we just don't think have got it. And of course, if we get 10 of them together, we can put them together in the one place, and that just keeps them out the road and nicely together. In the 60s and 70s, and this is where it starts to get a bit worrying, because I'm in school by the late 60s, but in the 60s and 70s, we had remedial education, so taking children out to be fixed, to be put back in again, remedial teachers, but we did have comprehensive education. So it doesn't matter what your school's called. You will find we have schools that are called Dunoon Grammar School, Hermitage Academy, Bannerman High School, but they're all comprehensive schooling, so we don't sift and sort to determine which school you go to. We've had that from the 60s, and I'm very grateful, because I'll tell you now, if we had sifting and sorting, I don't think I'd be standing here right now, because I don't think I would have got into the grammar school based on my performance in primary. So it mattered hugely, I think, that we have comprehensive education. And in the 2000 debate, national debate we had about education with teachers, and in the 2022 national discussion that we've just had, teachers want to keep comprehensive education. Hugely important, I think, for all of us. I'm getting very worried about the privatisation of education and what that might mean for some groups of learners. Oh, here we are. So in the 60s, there was lots of things happening. In actual fact, I read that and thought I could change 1960 for 2023. In 1960, the General Teaching Council for Scotland was set up because we are all interested in standards, in teacher standards. How do we help teachers to become good teachers, effective teachers? And so the General Teaching Council was set up. It's still ongoing, the General Teaching Council for Scotland, because other places got General Teaching Councils, so we had to put Scotland at the end. We had the idea too that we don't just do education in schools, we need to work collaboratively. So quite an interesting history, I think, when we start to think about inclusion and inclusive learning, and this notion of diversity, which is the big theme, of course, of the conference. A seminal moment was 1978. It was seminal for two reasons. One, this report came out that many of you will perhaps be familiar with if you've done reading around inclusion, the Warnock report, the report that was responsible for coining the phrase special educational needs. That came out. The other reason it was quite important was the year I started Jordan Hill. I started to learn to become a teacher. I found my prospectus in the attic, antique, I think. But we were looking at environmental studies. We were looking at progressive ideas of interdisciplinary learning. We didn't call it that, but it's what we would call it now. You do start to wonder, are there any new ideas under the sun when we come back and revisit them? But I remember in the lecture theatre in Strathclyde, Carol Hewitt telling us about this new report that had come out, and it was going to be groundbreaking, and it was going to influence Scottish education for a long time. And she was right, 26 years. We had that report. And it could be argued that in the 60s, with our comprehensive education, our progressive teaching, etc., that it did well for us. Scotland's quite interesting. We have a lot of Nobel Prize winners way more than you'd expect for a country of our size, many of them connected to this university. And the most recent one, Professor, I think he is a sir now actually, Professor David Macmillan, getting the Joint Award for Chemistry. And he said at the time, it was widely reported, that he felt it was his education that had helped him to get to where he is. He was educated not that far away from here and came and opened our our Advanced Research Centre and spoke about his time at school. But he was incredibly lucky, he says, to have come through that system. It shouldn't be about luck. He was fortunate. It was when he was born. It was where the system was. But it can't just be down to luck. And I think that is one of the problems that we need to really think about, how we work with our teachers, what our research is doing and saying that can inform teachers about how they can make their classrooms inclusive. Another seminal moment in Scotland was 2004, Additional Support for Learning Act. We've, of course, by then had the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, Convention on Disabilities, etc. Sorry, I'm trying to see how much time I've got left, and my phone's asking me to give me its password, sorry. There we go. So, so we've had all of these things that influence us all. And we were all grappling with this idea of what is inclusion, what does it mean, what do we do? And in our country, we said, Warnock was fine for its time. It helped move the traffic light idea. It helped move our thinking forward. But it's maybe had its day. We need to rethink. It's not doing it for everybody. And so we reconceptualized what we mean by special educational needs. And we stopped using that language and we started talking about young people who might require additional support for learning. Quite a different way of looking at it. But we didn't, as I say, just change the language. We were trying to change the philosophy, the philosophical underpinnings, what we meant by that. Who are we talking about now? And of course we had Sustainable Development Goal 4. Those 17 goals, very important for us. Especially number 4 for those of us involved in education, where it talks about ensuring inclusive, equitable, quality education and lifelong learning for all. And yet, if you've been to any of the panels here this week, you will know that these are words that are great words, very difficult to say, no, I don't think I can agree with that. I don't want to ensure inclusive and equitable. You can't, it's hard to disagree with, but oh my goodness, it's hard to do. It's hard to do, I think, as a researcher, and I think it's really hard to do as a teacher as well. But that's not a reason not to try. So in Scotland, we had rethought this idea of who needs additional support. We believe it took us down the green light, the traffic light, let us go through and down a much more inclusive road than we had hitherto been on. We brought in, if you like, now there's an issue over who brings in whom, and can I decide to be excluded? Thank you, I don't want to be included, and so on. But we started to say, well, if it's about us and not us and them, then we need to rethink and think about who is us. Us is all of us. And so there were many groups here for whom the label special educational needs just didn't fit. English as an additional language, children who had been bereaved, their mum, their dad, their sister, brother had died. Interrupted learners, so our Gypsy Traveller community who are out of school for a while and then come back into school. All of these young people, and you'll notice my more able and talented group here, suddenly schools were saying, right, okay, that's not how I'd thought about it before. At least some schools were saying it's not how I'd thought about it before. And so we would see that, and I would argue that shift in thinking is really important if we're serious about getting to meaningful inclusion. We can't have schools where it's about in and out and who is in and who is out. We need to think about all, us. That doesn't mean one teacher can do it all, and I'll come back to that, but it does mean that we need to think about the systems and structures that we have in place that allow this to happen. So the lights at green, I would suggest. The stage is set. We have good legislation in Scotland. Many other countries too have changed their legislation. But simply changing legislation in and of itself is not enough, because legislation only works if it translates into practice, and that's that gap. I always feel I've worked in the gap, and the two bits have sometimes bashed off me, the legislation and the policy, and I talk a lot to parents, and I'm saying, yes, but the legislation says, and they say, yeah, but the school says. So working in that gap, working in the gap, I think, is where we as researchers should be. Working in the gap in order to help bridge that gap, working alongside and with schools. So we have the system in place. It looks as though we have a green light. These are some quotes from highly able learners and from their parents. I'm going to pick one just to elaborate on a little bit. We were told she had hit the ceiling on the test. And I said, oh, right, okay, and then what happened? Well, nothing. She just had hit the ceiling. And I'm thinking, well, that's a bit like going into a radioactive room with a Geiger counter that goes up to 95 and saying, oh, wow, it's at 95. But actually, if I'd gone in with another bit of equipment that went to 360, maybe it would be at 360. So I think we need to think very carefully how we think about using the information that schools have. And I think schools are a huge holder of information. I just think they don't often get it all out and look at it and see what is it telling me. I think there's a role for us as researchers in there, a role for us as teacher educators in there to be working alongside and with schools to better use the information they have. There's often a call for more data. The UN often calls for more data. I would like us to use the data we have a little bit better sometimes. So does your work fit in there? Where are you working in that sphere? I'm going to show you some pictures quickly that I think illustrate where we are. So this was something called Reasons for Writing, and it was to assess whether you were ready to start that really intricate thing of handwriting. We had touched our eyebrows, we had touched our bodies, we knew we had shoulders, we'd put on the light, and here we have Exhibit 1. I am putting on the light. Great pencil control going on there, I think. If you know about drawing and these things, you know, lines within lines, circles, etc. Great attention to detail. Same day, same class, same instructions, and here we have number 2. If you know about drawing, you will know legs out the head is a stage that children go through. And then we came to number 3. Maybe some kind of existential Picasso thing going on here. But it, in one level, describes a range of readiness for writing. One of those children, little boy, this one in fact, could read. Extensive vocabulary. Could do all kinds of other things. Was not interested in handwriting. And yet so often we set up things that we judge children on. And when I happened to be sitting in the staff room and I was talking about the fact that this little boy had produced this, but he's really good at reading, somebody said to me, oh, well, he'll not be in your top reading group, will he? And I'm like, why would he not? Oh, well, he can't do the written follow-up work. Really? Is that how we're thinking still about young people? And I think the problem is, you see, that we do that, and then we do that. Now, we have to organise children for learning somehow. But I'm just not convinced that this is the best way to do it. I think this still harks back to some of those early ideas of our delinquents you sat in the wrong seats here. The delinquents in the front row, those of you that might not make it and will have to leave early, but oh my goodness, look at this lot. Some of that thinking is still around, I think, politically and within society. And I'm quite worried sometimes about some journal articles I've seen recently, talking again about IQ. In my view, a very dangerous road to start to go down, given its history with eugenics movement, etc. And by the way, some teacher input, the one that was in the bottom there, within a week. And by the 5th of September, what's another 2 weeks later? Teachers make a difference. It's what gets me up in the morning, actually, to come to work with teachers, to work with our students, because it can make such a difference. And if we're really interested in inclusion, if we're really interested in social justice, then those are the kinds of things that I think should excite you as researchers, that we can get to work with teachers, get to work with people who are going to help shape and influence and develop opportunities for all of our learners, and I mean all of our learners. But there's a bit of a tussle. We've got this excellence-equity tension, I think, going on. We want excellence, but it's got to be equitable. And sometimes, Jonathan Plucker at the top, a colleague from America, talks about policies therefore driven by wider societal issues, contexts. Because if we're still based on this idea of needs, then in actual fact, for the first time, the front row, you're going to be okay because you need the most. Because, no, I don't think it's the front row. I think it might be the fourth row, actually. You just can tell by looking, can't you? The fourth row, these high-label learners there. We actually need to think about, well, we don't need to think about them. They'll be fine. They'll go on in spite of us. And where there's scarce resources, and I don't know what it's like in your country, we don't have money sloshing around the education system. I saw a teacher post on Facebook the other day, is anyone else's school not buying in pencils? We're going to be sending home a list of stationery that we want you, child, to bring into school. That might be okay if you're financially able, but we have many families now who are struggling given the financial situation we have here. So there's an issue. If it's going to be about needs, then high label will never get a look in, and other certain groups do. I think we have moved, or trying to move, certainly here, and in many other countries too, we're trying to move towards that rights-based approach. You have a right to education. So as you sit there in that fourth row, you've got as much right to support as this row here. But in Scottish education, we have this tussle between this excellence and equity. And Catherine and myself wrote this article recently where we're talking about a gap that is not often spoken about. I've been in sessions in the last couple of days talking about that gap, the achievement gap. I am worried about it. Please do not misunderstand me. I am very worried about the children that have not engaged in education during COVID. I'm very, very worried about that. But I'm also worried about a gap that nobody's talking about, this excellence gap. Very interesting when you start to talk to teachers and schools, and still sometimes you come across that view of, yeah, but people from this kind of area don't go to university. Really? We need to challenge those things. I challenge you to go out there and challenge some of the assumptions, some of the comments like that are made wherever you work and in whatever aspect of research that you're working on. If Scotland's to pursue excellence, and I think we do want to, then we argue strongly that we cannot ignore the excellence equity agenda. We can't ignore high label pupils within that. They have to be part of it. And yet so often they're not, they're forgotten about. I was at a meeting just recently with a number of groups, and it was to discuss equality and equity. And I started to talk about multiple exceptional learners, young people who are highly able and autistic, highly able and dyslexic, highly able and. And a number of the groups there representing the and bit, if you would, went, oh, I hadn't thought in that. I've just left a fascinating panel talking about refugees, migrants, and asylum seekers. I don't often hear people talking about the highly able refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants either. So I think there's many places in our research that we should be thinking about all learners. And you will have your expertise, you will have your area that you are involved in. But can I put out a plea that now and again you just find out who is doing stuff with this group? The UN talked about wanting doctors and lawyers and scientists, and it's not just highly able people that become those, but those children, young people, do have something to contribute. I don't buy into they'll be the next leaders of the world, etc., etc. Some might be. I don't think all high label learners necessarily become leaders. But we need to make sure they've had the opportunity to know if they have the skills in order to become high label leaders. So, getting to meaningful inclusion. What does it mean? My 3 questions in practice for senior management, teaching and HE. Well, this won't be new to you if you're in the field of inclusion. You will know these kinds of things that I'm suggesting here, the creating classrooms, valuing all learners, teachers having confidence. So many pieces of research saying, teachers say, oh, I don't know how to work with children who are autistic, and I don't know how to work with children who are high label. And sometimes you go, who do you know how to work with? who is it you know what to do with? But it's interesting, teachers know an awful lot and are able to do an awful lot more than they think sometimes. And I think one of the jobs we have to do is about helping them to get that confidence. And they get that partly through this idea of career-long professional development. And for me, in my role, in my position, also valuing those links between research and policy and practice and bringing it round and saying, so what does it mean? I worked with Professor Niamh Stack, who now works in Ireland, but she was here for 17 years and we worked together. She was a psychologist, and together we brought different aspects to our research and to our writing and to our work. And she would often say something and I'd go, really? Do you think that's going to work? And I would say something, and she'd say, and what's your theoretical basis for that, Margaret? And this lot know her. But she's right, and I was right. We need to come together, and I really, really worry that we all work in our little silos and spend very little time talking to each other. And we spend very little time talking to other, not just, we spend little time in education talking to each other, and we spend even perhaps less time working with other colleagues in other subject areas as well. We have so much to learn when we work with each other. The National Framework for Inclusion is an example of us working together, and I can see dotted around the room a couple of faces here. But what's one of the things unique about this is the 9 universities that do teacher education in Scotland got together, and they worked together. And we produced this framework. And this framework is a series of questions from initial teacher education through to the idea of being an advanced professional. And you can look at it with a different lens. And all of us sitting around the table who worked on this document brought different expertise to the table. One of the things I always found fascinating was that when we got down to talking about a lot of the nitty-gritty questions, the person who came with the experience in visual impairment or in English as an additional language were saying very similar things to me as somebody who'd come thinking about highly able learners, because the pedagogy is the pedagogy. When we talked about relationships, it's relationships. Highly able learners need relationships with individuals too. They need to meet like-minded peers. So many things that are very similar across the different labels, if you like. And I think we need to be very clear that inclusion doesn't dismiss categories and labels. Inclusion is about how we work to make sure they are included and valued and part of our classes and schools. Another example of collaboration, I think, and one that in the UK we are missing dreadfully. Frank Cotton stood here and said we are, at the opening ceremony, and said we are proudly a European university, and we are, even although the UK is not in the European Union. We haven't been able to be part of Horizon 2020, we haven't been able to be part of Erasmus. We have lost out. And I was talking with a Turkish colleague, no, not Turkish, Albanian, colleague that I met yesterday in the street, and he said, but we've missed out not having you too. We have to work together, we have to collaborate. This was a wonderful project. In fact, there's some people here from Dublin City University and the Centre for Talented Youth. The universities, the researchers got together, But crucially, we got teachers together. And if you'd like to meet two of these teachers, Gillian and Catherine, the two in the middle, well, no, not middle when it's 5, is it? Anyway, two of them will be here tonight in the School of Education when we have our open house that I think it's open, but I think it's, well, numbers we've had to maybe constrain it a little. But if you're coming to that, do come and find us. Come and talk to us about what they were doing. They came back from that project. They had met other teachers from other countries, that idea of working together in collaboration. They took the ideas and they put them into practice, and the young people have benefited hugely from those. The materials available online. What does it mean for senior management? We have a great Into Headship programme here, because so often I think teachers are constrained because they haven't been told, have a go, give it a try, see what happens, learn from that experience in order to develop your practice further. I think there's a great opportunity there too for us as researchers to be working in schools with teachers in that kind of capacity. I developed a MOOC, and massive open online learning course, and I checked with the university, and it has apparently been one of our most successful MOOCs. We have almost 22,000 people that have undertaken the learning on that MOOC, and some really interesting feedback directly, emails directly to me, but also general feedback. And here's 2 examples, and that's what I think we need to be doing. I was also really interested that the Minister for Education in Rwanda sent round a notice and said, I want you all to do this MOOC. That was interesting. But that idea that senior management and in positions of authority saying, you need to go and learn, we need to learn together. This was not a MOOC that said, do what we do. This was a MOOC that raised issues and said, how does that fit with what you're doing? How does that fit with your resources? How does that fit with your philosophy, etc.? So an example perhaps where I think senior leaders have a really powerful role to play. Perhaps you're working in that area of research. And what does it mean in higher education? Well, I think we need to recognise we do have diverse students in front of us, and I think COVID has exacerbated that too. I think we need to take account of our teaching and supervision, what that means for us. My colleague in New Zealand and I were looking at gifted goes to grad school was the euphemism we'd given it. So we were looking at highly able learners in our work from schools and seeing those characteristics outplayed in some of our students and seeing some of those characteristics outplayed in staff. And boy, when you put 2 of that together sometimes, real fireworks. So how can we bring our learning into our research? Have you thought about high ability in university? What does that mean? And also this idea, again, of engaging in career-long, lifelong learning. I was part of a neurodiversity hub, a Wellcome Trust group, and I see a colleague, David, up there, who was part of that group too. And we came together to say, in our university, how do we support neurodiverse learners and staff as well? And it got us into some interesting places, asking interesting questions, looking at systems and structures within higher education. Do they include or do they exclude? Some students didn't like disability services as a title. I don't have a disability, I'm not talking to them. They were perhaps then not accessing support that they could have had. So lots of different areas, I think, that we could all be involved in this. I had the privilege of teaching in the Radboud Summer School in Nijmegen, and we had dentists on the course. Interested to see what did excellence beyond borders mean for them in dentistry. Really exciting. And I think if you are here because you work in a university, I do always feel we're in an incredibly privileged position. The opportunity we've just had, even just in these last few days, to meet people. I was on the welcome desk registering people, and the places people came from, fascinating. What an opportunity. Let's not waste it by not engaging and working alongside each other, working collaboratively to make sure that we make learning as better as it can be. Milenska, I know he's here at the conference, said that every learner matters and matters equally. That's a hallmark of inclusive education. We're not there yet in Scotland, I'm not sure we're there yet anywhere. But as you leave, as you're going to do very shortly, as you leave this room, my challenge to you, my charge to you, our principal stands here and gives a charge to the graduates at the end of our graduation ceremony. You know, we have a saying here in Glasgow, we welcome world changers. And I asked one of our graduates one day, so how are you going to change the world? And she went, do you know, Margaret, I'm just going to change it one child at a time. Even if that's all we do, that's hugely important. I think it was Gandhi that said it's better to light a candle than to curse the darkness. Do you recognise the 4-year-olds in the museum across there? Albert Einstein is attributed to say a lot, but I think he did actually say this, that intellectual growth should commence at birth and cease only at death. Perhaps that's a good motto to take away with you. Whatever we're doing, can we ensure that whoever we are working with, whatever group of learners, that we are helping them to grow and as they go on this journey. It's hugely empowering, learning. Learning is hugely empowering, and with this, I'm finishing. A teacher came in our course one day, and she sat at the back. She looked like this. And after a morning of this face, I thought, this is going to be a nightmare. She's here for a week. So I went up deliberately. I believe in relationships, and I believe in talking, and I believe... So I went up and I sat down and I said, so how are you finding the course ready for this kind of onslaught? And she said, it's brilliant, Margaret. It's amazing. And I'm like, really? Your face wasn't saying that? She said, I've really had to think. I thought, oh, it's your thinking face. But to fast forward, that was the start. She ended up doing the whole course. And she knocked my office door one day, and it was open, and I turned round, and I looked for a minute, and I went, oh, hello, I didn't recognise you. She said, I'm just here to tell you, I've handed in my dissertation. This has changed my life. And I'm thinking, no, a bit dramatic, but you know. And she said, no, but really it has, Margaret. And I said, oh, I'm delighted. She said, well, when I came in this course, because of my age, all my colleagues said I was off my head. But I tried the things you lot suggested, and it worked. So they came in and said, what are you doing? And I said, I'm doing all the stuff I learned in the course. And she said, I suddenly gained some confidence. She said, it made such a difference in my professional life. But she said, oh, it didn't stop there, Margaret. She said, I've had my hair cut. And I said, I knew there was something different. And then she said, and I've lost 2 stone in weight, and I've divorced my husband. So I didn't know whether at that point to rush off and write a self-help book. Come to our course, we change your life. But it was so interesting. She was so excited. And what she said to me was, it was the learning that allowed that to happen. If we can do that for our young people, my goodness, I fear less for the world if they leave us excited and ready to learn. So whatever capacity you're here in, researcher, lecturer, teacher in a school, whatever, I wish you well. This is not an easy route we've chosen, but my goodness, it's an important one, and one we cannot shy away from. Thank you.